Let's get back to the White House now, where we know President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump are greeting King Charles and Queen Camilla, who just arrived in Washington for a 4-day state visit. So I want to bring CBS News White House reporter Aaron Navarro back with us. Okay, Aaron, walk us through the King's schedule while he's here in the U.S. with the president.
We are expecting him to have tea along with the Queen at the White House with the First Lady and President Trump at the White House. After that, they will give a tour for them of the White House beehive on campus on the White House grounds. You're seeing a picture of that now, the south portico of the White House, the King getting out of the car and greeting President Trump. They will be here for about 4 days here in the U.S.
And Aaron, you see there President Trump shaking hands with Queen Camilla and First Lady Melania Trump giving 2 kisses to King Charles there as they meet in front of the White House ahead of, I believe, as you mentioned, I think they're having a tea in the gardens this afternoon. And, you know, Aaron, this comes at a time when tensions between the U.S. and the U.K. are at a height because of their disagreements over the war with Iran. How much is this visit with King Charles really a diplomatic visit to help soften those tensions?
As you mentioned, President Trump has shown his frustrations with the UK Prime Minister Starmer, especially over his initial opposition to the war with Iran. President Trump had criticized him for not doing enough, especially when it came to that crucial waterway of the Strait of Hormuz, and said eventually, once Starmer offered some help in terms of their military and navy, that it was too late. So the King coming here and spending so much time with President Trump could be a moment for him to apply some charm and strengthen the relationship between the U.S. and the United Kingdom, which has been strained, not only when it comes to this war with Iran, but President Trump criticizing immigration policy and economic policy in the United Kingdom under Starmer's tenure. We know that President Trump has an affinity towards the royals in the United Kingdom, sees them as a distinctively different body than the government ran by the Prime Minister King Starmer. So this could be a moment for them to talk about some of those issues and potentially for the King to kind of alleviate the tensions that we've seen in recent months between the U.S. and the U.K.
Aaron Navarro, thanks so much. All right, let's bring in BBC's Nada Tawfik. Nada, thank you so much for being with us. I'm curious, how do the Brits feel about this historic visit by King Charles and Queen Camilla to the White House?
Well, there is a real sense that this is the biggest diplomatic challenge of King Charles's reign. No doubt there has been intense focus on the growing rifts in the UK-US relationship, with some Liberal Democrats in the UK actually urging for the government to cancel this state visit, saying that they didn't want the King to go and be there at a time when President Trump was embarrassing the UK Prime Minister. But others, the Conservatives in the UK and from the Tory party, were very much hopeful that this would help mend relations. And so there is a bit of a divide about how, ordinary people and politicians in the UK feel about this visit. But no doubt, as we heard earlier there, President Trump is a royal enthusiast. I wrote for the BBC about how he recounted in his book, Art of the Deal, how at 6 years old, he watched his Scottish mother glued to the television all day for Queen Elizabeth's coronation, and how he got his love of showmanship and pomp and circumstance from her and her love of the royals. So whether this visit can kind of, that soft power, those personal touches, including, this tea at the White House behind closed doors, if that can help smooth out the UK-US relationship, then many will feel this visit has been a success. But on the other hand, Buckingham Palace is well aware of how unpredictable President Trump can be. And so this has been a highly choreographed visit, leaving very little room for kind of unscripted banter. We saw there at that photo op outside of the White House just how brief that greeting was before they went inside. And for the king, he is really someone who in many ways is the polar opposite of President Trump, not just in style and demeanor, but think about when he addresses the joint session of Congress. He is an environmentalist. He is someone who strongly believes in multilateralism and the so-called international world order. And so he'll be addressing lawmakers and the American public, trying to reassert the UK's interests, his values, as well as trying to not offend President Trump and to keep that charm offensive going.
It's really interesting to watch him play out this very diplomatic role, much like his mother did. And we saw when the Trumps visited the UK, King Charles really pulled out all the stops with that elaborate dinner at Buckingham Palace. And many people in the UK don't feel like taxpayers should be funding the monarchy anymore. I'm curious if just this diplomatic role that King Charles and Queen Camilla are playing here, if that actually is good for the monarchy, if the Brits feel like this is a good thing. It's good to have a figurehead like this who can come and make diplomatic relations with countries when tensions are strained.
Yeah, well, look, ultimately, as a constitutional monarch, the King's visit is really controlled and decided by the UK government. They are the ones that, in consultation with Buckingham Palace, go through not only what engagements he will have, but they also go through his speeches and include certain talking points and messages that they want to get through. So it will be interesting to listen throughout this visit, especially to that statement to the joint session of Congress, just the nuanced or hints of clues of what priorities the king and the government want to be clear on in those speeches. And I think historically, there has always been times of tensions, whether you go back to Margaret Thatcher with Ronald Reagan or even further back with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Churchill. There have always been times of tensions. And in those cases, we have seen the UK government use this kind of soft power, dispatching the royals to the US with all the kind of glamour and the pomp and circumstance that goes along with it, to use it as a reminder of the good times, of the shared kind of cultural, historical ties that have always bound the two countries. And so it was interesting to see that this trip was certainly planned years ahead of time, always to mark the 250th anniversary. Before it was known that either President Trump would be president or the Prime Minister would be Keir Starmer before those elections in the UK and the US. But that gives you a sense of how important Buckingham Palace finds these state visits to try to emphasize, those diplomatic ties.
Nada Tawfik, thank you so much. Great to be with you.